Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Erika Dyck. Erika is a professor of the history of medicine at the University of Saskatchewan, and she's a leading expert in the wave of psychedelic research that happened in the middle of the 20th century. The books she's written and edited include Psychedelic Psychiatry, LSD from Clinic to Campus, Psychedelic Prophets, The Letters of Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond, and A Culture's Catalyst, Encounters with Peyote in the Native American Church in Canada. In today's conversation, we explore the history of psychedelic research in the 20th century and what it can teach us about how we treat mental health issues today. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Erika Dyck. Erika, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, James.
So today we're going to be talking about the kind of use of psychedelics in Western medicine, the history in the 20th century. But I think maybe a good place to start might be with the kind of indigenous use of plants like peyote in the Americas, because my instinct is this is how it kind of came to the awareness of Western medicine in the first place. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think so. Yeah, I think there was a real fascination by anthropologists and chemists and ethnobotanists in what sort of plant medicines provided. And although there was an independent interest that was separate from Indigenous uses, I think some of the Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous uses of it became a real fascination for scientists. We see this stemming back through lots and lots of centuries, but in the 1920s, that really takes off, particularly, I think, as there's a desire to sort of extract chemicals out of plants and a bigger investment in pharmaceutical products that we see then taking off throughout the 20th century.
Right. And then, so I guess that leads to mescaline being one of the kind of earliest psychedelics that was kind of studied by psychiatrists. And then do we move into LSD in the 40s?
Yeah, I think mescaline's a really interesting story. And I mean, Mike J has written a fascinating book about this as the first psychedelic. And I know there's some new research going on, new research that looks at this history with fresh eyes, if you will. There's some interesting stories about the ways in which, in particular, sort of German-speaking chemists became very fascinated with the way that you could extract these chemicals or these substances out of the plants. And I think it goes hand in hand with a kind of westernization and even a medicalization or a scientization of plant knowledge and plant healing. And we see in that it's really difficult not to also recognize within that a kind of colonial legacy of then also pulling apart, not just actually physically removing things from plants and studying them in isolation from the plant, but also removing them from those cultural contexts and from those knowledge systems and studying them in a different context or in isolation from what we might think of as traditional or sacred practices.
Right, yeah, I think that's really, and I'm sure that's something we'll talk about later as well, is this distinction between traditional, maybe more holistic systems ways of thinking about health versus the kind of Western reductionist model. And I guess in the West, well, whereas you had kind of, healers or shaman dealing with these substances in traditional cultures, in the West, I guess our equivalent is the kind of psychiatric institution and the kind of medical mainstream. And we see the renaissance that's now going on in research and the renaissance that happened, well, the initial wave that happened in the 50s, which you're an expert in. And it seems that leads the way in the culture, right? In maybe in a kind of, those are the authorities that we follow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a historian and not a clinician, so I'm really interested in sort of how these stories are told or which stories tend to stick with us or resonate with us. And I find it really fascinating, which voices we prioritize in this history. And it does seem that over the course of the last 150 years at least, we've tended to trust or sort of put our faith in those who look more like white-coated scientists than even some of the scientists who took off their white coats and grew their hair long in the 1960s or something, though they may have had the credentials, there's still this sort of tension over who are the real authorities on this kind of, you can use different language here, whether it's psychedelics or entheogens or chemical substances or, different ways that people use that vocabulary to claim a kind of position in these debates.
Right. So maybe if we dive into the history, maybe a good place to start is the often told story of how LSD was kind of discovered. And, I guess it kind of came into this pre-existing work on mescaline, but maybe would you mind giving us a little recap of that story?
Sure. The LSD story?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sure that some of your listeners will be familiar with this, so apologies to anyone who already knows this story or can tell it in their own vocabulary. Um, yeah, it's quite a colorful and fascinating story of a chemist in Switzerland, Albert Hofmann, who in 1938 first synthesized LSD, or D-lysergic acid diethylamide. And as the story goes, first told in his own words, in his own book about LSD, his problem child, he was hired by Sandoz pharmaceutical company to explore headaches, cluster headaches, and he was looking for different kinds of substances. So it wasn't his goal to discover LSD per se. And in fact, the vial sat on a shelf for several years before he had firsthand experience with it. And in April 1943, as the story goes, some from a vial spilled on his hand and it plunged him into the very first LSD experience. So even before the word psychedelic was coined, Albert Hofmann went on his bicycle and described being plunged into a Salvador Dali painting where his legs were pumping the pedals, but he felt like he was moving in a rippling chasm of all sorts of different kind of cartoonish, almost distortions of his reality. He was worried at first that he had driven himself mad, and he didn't understand that these effects would wear off. So at first he locked himself in a room and was concerned that his wife needed to keep the children from him. But after a few hours, this sensation wore off, and he started to become much more reflective. And a few days later, he then knowingly took LSD again and began a lifelong commitment to exploring this amazing, fantastic, as he described it, his problem child, this powerful chemical that altered his consciousness, altered his reality, and also he felt was a real fascinating insight into the human mind. And with his discovery, this sort of launched a new era of research that then looked both back at precedents, so at other kinds of chemicals that created this similar kinds of sensations, distortions of perception, for example, but also created a fascination in the use of LSD, which almost in an unprecedented way, Sandoz made freely available to researchers who had a bona fide interest in this research. And so it also, we think about the different kind of economics of this research, making a drug freely available for that kind of study at this time was also rather risky or radical, and perhaps also then attracted a whole swath of people interested in this kind of research. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's perfect. That was excellent potted history. So then I guess that brings us up to maybe the late 40s. As you say, Sandoz have made this widely available. There's a lot of research going on, right, in major cities. And then you have Weyburn in Saskatchewan becoming this kind of epicenter of all places of psychedelic research. So what was it about the kind of the political climate, I guess, of Saskatchewan that made that possible?
Yeah, so I think throughout the 1940s, D-lysergic acid diethylamide research, or LSD research as it became known quickly, it was sort of in fits and starts. It wasn't necessarily as attractive as we would come to know it throughout the 1950s in particular. By the end of the 1950s, there were over 1,000 publications that focused on either mescaline or lysergic acid or LSD. It kind of comes up with different names, but essentially the same thing. All Sandoz produced. What happened in Saskatchewan is interesting because for anyone who has been to Weyburn, it does qualify as a city by Saskatchewan standards, but by most standards in the world, no one would think of this as a booming metropolis. It has since been, oil sands have been identified close to it, so it is booming to a small degree now. But at the time, it was a fairly rural place. Perhaps the two sort of claims to fame. One was that it had one of the largest psychiatric hospitals. People who worked there and who were familiar with the terrain have argued that this was the largest Victorian-style asylum in the British Commonwealth. So not insignificant, and whether in fact it was the largest one or not, I think that's disputed, but needless to say, it's a significant building and a significant almost industry within this place that really, I wouldn't say it was the center of town. In fact, geographically it was separated from it, but it certainly sort of focused the energy and a lot of the employment and economy of the town. It was centered around the asylum. In 1951, Humphrey Osmond, the psychiatrist a psychiatrist, came from London, and within a couple of years became the superintendent of the Saskatchewan Mental Hospital at Weyburn. And he brought with him a real interest and fascination in mescaline. And I think, interestingly, he was brought to Saskatchewan. He answered an ad in the Lancet that had been placed there by the Saskatchewan government. And again, for some sort of Canadiana trivia, perhaps, Saskatchewan was the birthplace of what now Canadians call Medicare, or our publicly funded healthcare system, our NHS, if you will. And Saskatchewan was not only the birthplace of it, but the premier and health minister, one and the same person. His home riding and hometown was Weyburn. And so he's sort of at this political epicenter, even though it's a small place off the beaten path. It is definitely a dynamic place in terms of the intellectual energy and the political enthusiasm that came with really mounting the first so-called socialist government in North America, and the first publicly funded healthcare system at a province-wide jurisdiction, which later was picked up by the federal government. So it's kind of an exciting moment. And to have this guy who comes over from London with an interest in mescaline at the same time, and in fact responding directly to an ad for somebody who's willing to head up research that would support these political goals, is something quite remarkable. Maybe even cosmic that these two pieces came together at once. Osmond described later that although Saskatchewan was windswept and cold in the winter, and his wife probably never forgave him for dragging their family from London, England to Weyburn, Saskatchewan, the place did afford him the time and the space and the kind of cultural cushion or cultural support that he needed to sustain his research that began with mescaline and very quickly moved to LSD. Working inside one of these major asylums or major mental hospitals also really stimulated him to think deeply about the plight of people with major mental illnesses. And I think right through to his dying day, he would say that for him, LSD and psychedelics, a word he would come to coin, but these substances were a means to an end for understanding major mental illness, and he really deeply thought about them in a healing way. So I think that combination of factors really led to a really dynamic research space where suddenly this windswept place on the prairies became an epicenter of intellectual energy as people traveled to it in order to participate in the unfolding of what we would later describe as the first psychedelic experimentation.
Right. And as you say, right, the word psychedelic hadn't actually been coined at this point. So was his initial research, was this in the kind of the psychotomimetic paradigm where it was treated as a model of psychosis?
Absolutely. Initially, Osmond very much believed that this was a way to see into the madman's eyes. He described it like that. But this madness mimicking properties was something that really attracted him to. He felt that it was a way that both he, but also his colleagues as psychologists and psychiatrists, but also social workers, government administrators, nurses, social workers, he might even say family members, although I haven't found that exactly, that they could empathize. So not simply to have a proximate experience rather, so that one could sort of study it from that basis, but to provide better care to people, for example, who have schizophrenia, who might be hallucinating, is that even if you have auditory hallucinations more prominently with schizophrenia, having a visual hallucination and just tampering with your sense of self and the edges of yourself or the boundaries of yourself is enough to help to trigger a sense of empathy that is very difficult to accomplish without being able to sort of take yourself out of your own reality. And he felt that that was a really powerful experience that would help people to empathize, whether people were living in institutions or whether people were then later living in communities.
So it seems from the start there's a very kind of a broad conception of what it is to kind of engage in healthcare, rather than, you know, maybe more restrictive pharmacological interventions where you have a kind of detached kind of hierarchical relationship between the caregiver and the patient. Is it right to say this seems more of like an empathetic, more wide-reaching way of engaging with someone's health?
Absolutely. I think I can't help but be a historian because that's who I am. So I think some of the historical context is also critical here, because if you imagine, you know, in 1953, the word psychedelic, or sorry, I'm zooming ahead, 1956 is when the word psychedelic actually is coined. But in that period, Osmond and others are coming out of more of a psychoanalytic environment. And I know that's a fairly broad generalization, but if you imagine the kind of training that psychiatrists were going through in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, they tended to be focused more on psychotherapeutic, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic kinds of training sessions. So different from a psychopharmaceutical paradigm, which comes a little bit later. The first antipsychotic medication, which is released in 1952, becomes a blockbuster, chlorpromazine or thorazine, largactil. This drug becomes a landmark for changing the way we think about pharmaceuticals applied to mental illness. But that happens really at the same time that drugs like psychedelic drugs like LSD and mescaline are being tested. And so the context for running those experiments was not yet RCTs, was not yet within the kind of pharmaceutical paradigm. And so I think there was more, I guess maybe there was a little bit more acceptance of thinking about physicians, clinicians taking those drugs and then monitoring their patients. It wasn't necessarily considered unethical, because if anyone had gone through psychoanalysis, the only way to become an analysan is to go through your own therapy first. So it followed a different kind of ethic for how we sort of articulate empathy and the power or the sort of significance of empathy in a psychotherapeutic setting. So if we zoom ahead 10 years from then, that context changes quite dramatically as we embrace randomized controlled trials as a kind of gold standard, and we really prioritize that kind of objective or distanced observer rather than one who is, holding hands with their patient or going through something that they may have some direct experience with themselves.
Yeah, I mean, this sounds very resonant with what you said at the start about the kind of reductionist mode of kind of extracting things from nature and extracting substances from different traditions. And it feels like in the 60s or the 50s, you had this potential for the reductionist kind of pharmacological model that has now kind of come to dominate healthcare, but also this more complex, nuanced, and harder to profit from, I would say, I guess, right? Model of psychedelic therapy.
Yeah, I find the prophet stuff fascinating, and something that at the time when I was doing the research in the early 2000s, I think I was sort of vaguely aware of, but I didn't appreciate just how prominent it was. And it's really upon reflection that I see this as a bit of a missed opportunity. But the economics of it are fascinating, because in the context of the region that is trying to show the world it can create a publicly funded healthcare system that embraces these kind of like economically efficient models of healing, this one session, single dose session of a psychedelic psychiatry is like really powerful, really exciting for someone who's looking for making a budget line for how much we're going to spend on healthcare. If you're a pharmaceutical industry, having a single session is probably not the most economically attractive model that you want to support. Daily use pharmaceuticals, which become the norm by the 1960s, and certainly since, those are much more economically viable. So depending on the perspective that you're at, I think there are these really interesting sort of political economy perspectives that are woven into this story, and I think nicely sort of fit with the mythology around psychedelics, that they are more libertarian or more socialist. And I'm not sure that all of those myths are really accurate, but I think there's something to the kind of, taking it to the man, sort of notion that psychedelics embolden this kind of championing of a different kind of ethos. And I don't know, the symmetry is quite nice.
Yeah. I mean, and you pointed to the fact that I think from the start, right, these substances were not being given in small doses like you would take an SSRI or something. They'd be given in usually relatively large doses, one or two times, or maybe several times. And in the beginning, was addiction the kind of thing they moved on to, like alcoholism, after the psychotomimetic stuff?
Yeah. So in the case of the Saskatchewan experiments, and that's where I've spent most of my research energy, is focusing on those ones. So I don't want to speak for what was going on at Spring Grove or what was going on in the Veterans Hospital in LA or something, because there are variations to the timeline on this. But with the case in the sort of psychedelic ones, where the word was originally coined, as they were sort of zeroing in on that word and trying to understand the distinctions between a psychomimetic. So do we want to mirror mental illness, or do we want to use this as a window into mental illness? It was sort of on the path to that articulation that they started thinking about the similarity. Well, which mental illness are we mimicking? And is this mostly schizophrenia, for example, or psychotic disorders in general, and is it like delirium tremens? And so they sort of grew out of the same impulses, and I think happened relatively in parallel. The alcoholism studies, or the studies that focused on using LSD and mescaline to treat alcoholism, really picked up quite quickly. And I think there was much more momentum behind it, and the psychomimetic hypothesis fell under criticism much more quickly. So it kind of melted away more quickly than the alcoholism one. But the same principles really prevailed, in the sense that it was a single dose. I think I've transcribed I haven't personally, my team, my wonderful undergraduates and graduate researchers, have transcribed probably 1,000 reports now from some of the clinical trials in a few different jurisdictions. And the vast majority of those trials that took place, our dates run from 1952 to 1974, the vast majority are single dose sessions. Very few people had a repeated dose, at least as registered in those trials. Now, it doesn't capture anyone who took doses outside of the clinical setting or who moved to a different clinic, but there's quite a lot of correspondence amongst the clinics, so I'm relatively confident that still the majority were taking it once, with all the caveats. But the single dose session was meant to really kind of create a breakthrough, or have like a sort of significant effect. And so initially they were upping the doses, thinking that the doses would calibrate with the sort of intensity of the effects. But within a few months, and within, once they got a sample size that was a little bigger than themselves, they realized that actually the doses didn't necessarily correspond with the intensity, and that it had a lot more to do with the kind of what they would later describe as set and setting. So the intention, what people were expecting to experience, and what they brought with them in terms of psychological baggage or trauma or expectation, had much more to do with the intensity of the experience than the actual dosage itself. I don't know if I've wandered off your question.
No, not at all. No, so they were expecting, I guess, to simulate the delirium tremens that you mentioned, right? This kind of alcohol withdrawal kind of experience that people credit to kind of helping them stay off of relapsing into alcohol. But then I guess they started to observe more what you might call spiritual experiences. Is that right?
Yeah, it's interesting. The initially, like the very first experiences, or experiments rather, that they ran with alcoholics, and I should say, like, even to call someone an alcoholic at that time was controversial, because there was still debate as to whether this was a medical disorder or whether this is a social disorder. Are these bad people, or are they disordered people? And so in that context, it was even slippery to determine, who would be an appropriate candidate for this kind of experience. At first they thought that, and I kind of love this, I find this really fascinating, intellectually very interesting, that it was very much focused on men. And one of the reasons that was described to me by one of the patients who came through this program was that he said, being an alcoholic was kind of macho. I mean, women weren't allowed to drink in public in many regions at this time, so we'll just put that aside for a moment as to how women express their disorders. But he said, one of the men who described this to me said, what he really wanted to do when he wanted to drink, he wanted to fight, he wanted to, swear, he wanted to be, sort of larger than life, and, take on these kind of macho characteristics, even stereotypical. And he said, all of the kinds of interventions that were available to him at the time, and he recognized that he had a problem. He'd said this particular man had spent some time in jail. He knew that actually he needed to fix himself, but he didn't really want to. And he said, going and sitting at Alcoholics Anonymous and telling my friends about my problems was the opposite of how he wanted to live his life, drinking and fighting. But when somebody approached him and said, you want to really go out of your mind, try this. He said it was the kind of intervention that really appealed to him where he was at. And it allowed him to sort of express himself in that macho way, but also it brought him to his knees and it made him weep and it allowed him to appreciate what attending the sessions at Alcoholics Anonymous had to offer. And so I think it's an interesting, it's not a magic bullet. And certainly even those early investigators trying to sort of play around with the parameters of this, they didn't see it as like, aha, this will make you dislike the taste of alcohol, or, this will turn you into another kind of an addict. This was a single whopping session that they thought would frighten these guys and say, if you don't stop drinking, this will happen to you. But the vast majority of those sessions did not end with terror. They didn't end with people seeing the kinds of scaly, horrific things that they expected them to. And many of them had, I don't know how to quite capture it. I want to choose my words carefully because some of them describe overtly spiritual experiences, and others it's just kind of a gentle, softer set of reflections that sort of chips away at that ego, some of the words used by those psychoanalysts, the kind of, I don't know, macho ego perhaps that you might imagine. And I think over time, spirituality became one of the themes that investigators and observers were able to play with and pull on because there was a little bit of coherence there. But it's tricky to really, I still struggle with this a little bit because the first thing that happened after they came through these sessions was either they were expected to attend a church service, it was the 1950s and this was a normalizing thing, or Alcoholics Anonymous, where there were also overt spiritual tones in many of those meetings. So there is a bit of a chicken and an egg here, that there is an element of spirituality, and also they were sort of conditioned to see that as one of their ways through this process.
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing to point out. The kind of these high dose psychedelic experiences can almost be a kind of a macho version of confronting your vulnerabilities. Like, I'm going to die, I'm going to be thrown, do this big scary thing that shows how brave I am, and but you're still, the thing you're doing is usually confronting these traumas and things. But it's, by doing it in one day, getting out of the way, facing it full on. I hadn't really made that connection before, but I think that's really insightful. But also, I guess this relates to, you've also written about the because this was such a gendered society, right? I think, is it right that women were kind of helping a lot in these trials, but not really getting on the papers and things?
Yeah, I mean, you're in neuroscience, I believe, right? So you've heard of, these things still happen today. It's not something that has completely gone away.
That's
that,
true, yeah.
Now we suddenly have gender parity on all of our papers and all of our grants and things. So part of it, I think, is just a deeper institutional legacy of women in science or women in STEM, or women in academics more broadly, or positions of power. But with that caveat, I will acknowledge that this is not specific to psychedelics. But what I find fascinating about how this relates to psychedelics is that very early on, I think there was a recognition, even if it wasn't articulated in a coherent way, there was a recognition that preparing someone for these sessions took a kind of labor, a kind of work. Some of that work is maybe taken for granted, but it was recognized that you can't just, it's not a good idea to just spike the punch at some party and expect someone to have a therapeutic breakthrough. There's lots of stories to suggest that was bad. But in the clinical setting, people were prepared for these experiences. They were acknowledged as they went through the experiences, often with an empathetic observer, that is someone who had gone through, at least had taken the substance themselves, sometimes at the same time. And then a period of integration that sometimes required creating space for someone to sort of process those feelings and those experiences on their own, but in a place where they weren't left entirely alone, but also to have someone there to talk to. And along the way, there are all sorts of bits and details of how to organize those sessions and how to create that structure, that what we're finding is that women were absolutely integral to a lot of the kind of details that we maybe later take for granted. Who brought the rose into the room? Probably Al Hubbard. Many people say that Al Hubbard was the one who introduced the rose. Whether he did or not, his wife was by his side many times, and she was often the one taking notes. She even adjusted the musical selections in the room at times. And many people remember Al Hubbard, and of course he's been written about by several people. But Ruth Hubbard, now I'm getting Roses and Ruths mixed up. Ruth Hubbard was very integral to this. And what I started trying to follow was, where were some of the women in these experiments? Some of them were paid, some of them were nurses or social workers participating directly in a paid environment. But many, many times there were wives of investigators who, you know, it wasn't necessarily uncommon for wives to participate in their husbands' careers. And I come from a farming background. This is just completely normal. Of course, you know, of course my mother would make the meals and prepare all of these things. And without that, the crop could not be taken off the land. But, you know, at the end of the day, the paycheck comes to the farmer who takes the grain to market, if I use that example. And so there's a similar kind of philosophy in 1950s science, where the men are the main breadwinners and they go off and do the things that create the paychecks, but women and their children, in fact, often support the activities. And in the world of psychedelics, it becomes even more intimate, as wives are often the first people to take these substances with their investigator husbands, and to work through and to give language to those experiences, to almost help their husbands feel confident talking about them, to make sense of them, to give meaning to them. And I think that piece is really, really critical as we think back through the history of psychedelics, but also the contemporary ways in which we try to make sense of psychedelics in today's world. You know, how we give meaning to them, or whose words we choose to use, or how we prioritize those feelings of spirituality or psychological feelings of trauma, or whatever it might be. And so I think there's a longer legacy here of the gendered factors, whether we take the sort of macho alcoholic, or the, you know, woman who is described often with a sort of strong emotional state, who's able to like help you make sense of your experience. So I don't know, that sort of stuff kind of fascinates me as we think about psychedelics, even beyond the more institutional setting of women in science.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also something that hasn't really occurred to me before, that with all of the kind of sensitive or like nurturing aspects of psychedelic therapy, it didn't really occur to me that it's unlikely that men conditioned to be men in the 1950s in American Britain would have single-handedly been able to access all that stuff without some outside assistance. It makes sense that, you know, that was there. But then, so on the kind of these participants were having these kind of, sometimes having these kind of spiritual experiences. And is it around this time that Aldous Huxley becomes interested in the use of peyote, I think, in the Native American church, and then reaches out to Osmond? Is it right that Huxley initiated that correspondence?
Yeah, so I think it's 1951, but, you know, I'd want to check before quoting myself. But it's around 1951 where Osmond published a paper with a colleague, John Smithies, and Abe Hoffer. So Abe Hoffer's in Saskatchewan. John Smithies at this time was still in London. And the three of them had been working on a psychomimetic model. And they presented that in this published paper. And it was Smithies who was actually first in touch with Huxley. But there was a bit of a falling out with Hoffer and Osmond sort of on one side of this relationship, and Smithies on the other. And so by the time that Huxley and Smithies connected, and they were geographically closer, Smithies was sort of distancing himself from the psychedelic world, and he recommended that instead he reach out to Osmond. So I was very, very fortunate to be part of a brilliant team of editors and just wonderful people all around. And we transcribed all of the correspondence between Humphrey Osmond and Aldous Huxley. And I paused to stifle laughter there, because Osmond uses a kind of shorthand script, and he print writes and makes words smaller than they are. And it's such a challenge to work with, but it also is such a wonderful insight into him as a person. He's so brimming with ideas. He's almost manic and enthusiastic about this work that he can't even write his words out. He's just so excited to say them. And over the course of about 700 pages of letters back and forth, we were really, really pleased to bring this work forward a couple of years ago to show this beautiful relationship that develops from that one sort of casual, I hear you're the guy to talk to about these experiences. You may know that I'm a writer, you know, Aldous Huxley writing to this psychiatrist in Canada. And Humphrey Osmond, you know, ever the enthusiast and optimist, he hops in his car and drives from Weyburn, Saskatchewan to Beverly Hills, and with mescaline in his pocket. It may not have been in his pocket, but on his person, and brings Aldous Huxley his first dose of mescaline in 1953. Very soon after that, in fact, it's about a month before, from the time that they meet until the first draft of Doors of Perception, that Aldous Huxley is so overwhelmed and inspired by this meeting. And over the course of even just a few years, these two men and their wives actually become a really close unit. They correspond frequently, eloquently, and very candidly. And it's a beautiful insight into their relationship, but also their attempts to make sense of this unfolding world and what it means in the context of the Cold War. And both of them are British expats living outside of their sort of home communities. And so they're also trying to make sense of this North American culture at the same time that they try to understand this growing appetite for drugs that they come to call psychedelics. And I will say, so in 1956, Aldous Huxley writes to Osmond and says, we need to come up with a word to capture the sensations of these experiences, because there is no word in the English language designed to convey these sensations. And he says, to make this mundane world sublime, just half a gram of phanerothine. And on the typed letter, because Huxley's letters are often typed, Osmond scribbled all around it, and there's all of these like pen marks, and he's just crossing out things, and he's trying to make sense of this. And ultimately he writes back and he says, no, that's a Huxley word, it's too incomprehensible. And he says, to fall in hell or soar angelic, you'll need a pinch of psychedelic. A year later it was published in the New York Academy of Sciences, and it was officially launched into the English lexicon.
It's funny, it has that kind of, it really does sound like a kind of 1950s jingle, like I can imagine with a kind of like vibraphone on an advert or something. It's a kind of nice timestamp, because it shows you, we're talking 10 years before, I guess, LSD was outlawed as a result of the kind of the cultural fallout, and the culture changed so much in that time. I feel like that the rhythm of that phrase is, I doubt you'd have, in the 60s that had kind of gone by the wayside, that kind of quite earnest way of being. But so then with Huxley's input into this stuff, am I right that they both attended peyote ceremonies at the Native American church?
They did. So Huxley did so in California, and although they maintained close contact, they weren't able to visit each other as much as they wanted to. So many of the things that they did in kind of the world of psychedelics was often done in isolation, then they would talk to each other about it. Humphrey Osmond attended one here in Canada in 1956, so the same time that the word itself was coined. And he was invited to participate in a ceremony that was put on by the Native American Church of Canada, which is in part, at that time, was in part a response to the federal government's declaration that it was going to change the Indian Act, and it did change the Indian Act to prohibit certain cultural rights. And so in that moment, so in a whole different conversation about, what is an authentic expression of being culturally Indigenous, or what is an appropriate religious response to colonialization, those conversations are taking place in different corridors. And the sort of peyote ceremony comes up in between those. So in a sense, it's sort of caught in this moment of determining the value of psychedelics, as well as it's part of a conversation about, Indigenous cultural rights. And Osmond, I think much to the surprise of some of the government investigators who thought, oh, don't worry, we've got this, psychiatrist, he's going to go and straighten this all out. And Osmond goes and, sort of characteristically, as anyone who knows about him now seems totally normal, but he goes and he says, well, this is a beautiful thing. This is absolutely critical for the healing of Indigenous people. This is, their territory has been ripped away from them, and he's very empathetic. And he writes a fairly strongly worded sort of treatise, which then gets picked up by different legal teams as they are trying to make openings for peyote in Canada. And the federal government just sort of cuts him off, and they're like, that wasn't the scientist we meant to go there. But there's a clash, it seems, of both race and privilege that takes place in that moment that today we have different vocabulary for describing that, and we maybe take it for granted that of course there's a clash there. But I think it's also an interesting sort of window into, again, that, you know, appropriation of Indigenous knowledge and different ways of thinking about healing and spirituality in that moment.
Right. And I feel like that, would you say that there's a parallel between the kind of the rich holistic aspect of the kind of way it's used in Indigenous cultures and the broad scope of the research? Because they, you know, and maybe Huxley's input was important here as well, but all right, they were thinking beyond just kind of physiology and therapy to kind of theology and other areas, right?
Absolutely. And I think people like Bill Richards, and, you know, in the past, he's really focused on this and given us much more to think about in terms of where those ideas of theology and spirituality come into play. I think, you know, or maybe it's my own lack of understanding of, you know, the depths of spirituality and theology to give this real proper expression. But I think that Osmond and Huxley are both sort of fumbling around with this to some degree. I mean, in their letters, this comes through even more clearly than in some of the stuff that Huxley writes, which is quite polished and, you know, articulate and thoughtful. But in their letters, as they're trying to work this out, I mean, they're sort of grasping at different edges of this and wondering, you know, is one of the things that really resonated with me was the way that they describe one of the powerful things about, my words, sort of Indigenous approaches to plant healing or psychedelics. They said is the ways in which there is deference paid to the molecule. And they distinguish that from the ways in which we might approach aspirin. You know, take, for example, you know, I'll go to my medicine cabinet, I'll take aspirin, I won't thoughtfully prepare myself for what it might do to alleviate the pain in my head. I won't pay attention to my surroundings. But they said in preparation for a peyote ceremony, you know, you think about what you've eaten. You know exactly how much liquid you've taken in. You know, you cleanse yourself in some respects. You meditate. You really participate in a preparation that we don't tend to do in Western models of medicine. And they felt that that was something that was very much lost in what eventually they, not so much Huxley, but Osmond goes on to identify the kind of pharmaceutical wave that overwhelms our modern medicine. And he said, wait, whoa, like this is, we've forgotten a whole, or we've sort of sidestepped a whole part of paying deference to the kinds of chemicals we put in our bodies.
Right. And it sounds like, so in this kind of Saskatchewan approach, there's this kind of appreciation of the way that context and all the things you said, intention, you know, environment, all interact with the chemical to produce the effects, right? But is it right that at the same time there was research going on in Toronto that was based around a more reductionist or, you know, model where they would strap people to beds and just give them the chemical and leave them alone?
Yeah, and it's fascinating because I think the Addictions Research Foundation in Toronto, I mean, of course, there are many other research units that are trying to either repeat the results or test the claims that psychedelic researchers had. And I think it's probably important to note for context that when the LSD treatments for alcoholism findings were published and other units started repeating these, they were making claims that were unheard of. They were unprecedented. You know, 50% recoveries, 90% recoveries was, I think, the largest claim I saw. Now, doing just a little bit of digging, you discover that they got really good at determining who would be a good candidate for those kinds of experiments, and that increased their results. But needless to say, these results are also kind of mystifying to anyone engaged in non-psychedelic research who might feel upset or competitive even in this moment. Maybe that's not so bad, but what's happening at the Addictions Research Foundation in Toronto, of course, their whole orientation of their institution is to focus on addiction research. So to have these upstarts over in some place that's not Toronto, you know, creating this was, I think there was also some sort of collegial tension or competition there. They were also very heavily invested in marijuana research at the time. So I think, you know, at this time, there were a number of, David Healy describes this as the golden age of psychopharmacology. And he says that there are more sort of first generation psychopharmaceuticals introduced in that period than ever before or since. And if we think about that, like this is the first SSRIs, the first, so there's a really hot period for investing in these kind of competitive strategies for both a kind of methodology, but also the substances themselves. So in that context, as RCTs are kind of coming into play, the Addictions Research Foundations as well, what's happening in Weyburn has nothing to do with the drug. These guys are doing drugs with their patients, which was true. These guys are hiring attractive nurses, my favorite concern, and they're putting them in nice rooms. These guys are used to jail cells and, you know, drunk tanks. And now you put them in a room with a couch, with a rug, and you bring them flowers and like fresh coffee. Of course, they're going to say they feel better. And so to challenge that model, they strapped them to beds, they blindfolded them, they tried to sort of minimize or mitigate those external factors that they felt were producing essentially a placebo effect. And unsurprisingly, the people who came through those experiences had a terrible experience, even though some said that it wasn't terrible, but the results were really quite different. And so this, again, it challenges the substance, but it challenges the methodology, I think, even more so. And it brings forth a different kind of debate about the direction of pharmaceutical research in the second half of the 20th century.
Yeah, it seems what strikes me is that the Toronto approach seems to have an illusion that the being strapped to a bed isn't a context. You know, it's kind of saying there's no context here; it's just the chemical. But I would say being strapped to a bed in that kind of clinical setting is its own context. And I guess what they've proved, if you take them both in conjunction, is that these is the importance of set and setting for these compounds. I guess, right?
Exactly.
And I also wanted with Hollywood Hospital in Vancouver was another site. You mentioned Al Hubbard as well, right? Is that where he was based doing research?
I mean, I think Al Hubbard is really difficult to pin down. He pops up all over the place. He was also a pilot. He uses different names. He claims different kinds of authority and experience. So I wouldn't say he's based anywhere. But yes, he did pop up there. He sometimes frequented Hollywood Hospital. He also shows up in Weyburn a couple of times. And there is a kind of a network, I think, of investigators, some of whom would describe themselves as like-minded, and others kind of got moved to the margins throughout this period.
Right. And so then you also have Bill W., the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? I think he became interested in LSD research through connected with Osmond, was it? With I think he had a mystical experience on belladonna and then later on LSD, is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, Bill W. was the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous in the 1930s. And it's interesting, there are a few different competing stories about this. And so, you know, somewhere in there lies the truth. But he had sort of his own ideas and his own experiences that predate his sort of psychedelic experiences, if you will. And he does correspond with Osmond, He corresponds with Osmond, and firstly, they're just sort of trying to establish the territory, I guess, for, you know, who's right here. It's sort of interesting because what's happening in Saskatchewan is a little bit off the beaten path, or it's very much off the beaten path, but it's also, you know, a time before the internet and virtual meetings. I mean, it takes longer for information to travel into published documents and get a reaction. So these letters between these men really are kind of before it becomes known. And Bill W. is kind of nervous at first about revealing, like, that he would endorse any other kind of psychoactive substance, because of course abstinence is key in the AA 12-step program. But also he confides or explains to Osmond that one of the hardest steps he felt we're mostly talking about men here, for men in the 1950s to join is step number 2, which has gone through a few different iterations, and I won't be able to quote it here, but essentially is to believe in something higher or of a power greater than yourself, you know, and different iterations actually invoke, you know, a kind of God complex. And this is a kind of spiritual step. He said that this is the hardest step to overcome, and it is sort of the biggest barrier to people staying with the program. And this is where Osmond then talks to his colleague Abe Hoffer, and they're like, well, you know, I think this experience that we've been playing around with would help that. And Bill W. comes and takes LSD and agrees that it is similar, but he doesn't want to let people know that at first because it would compromise his integrity as the co-founder of AA. But interestingly, although I found that in some research units, they're very careful and coy about whether they're coordinating with Alcoholics Anonymous. I did find that newsletters produced by Alcoholics Anonymous in local chapters were actually advertising psychedelics as a way to help get you connected. And so there clearly was some cooperation taking place in certain chapters of the organization, but it's a bit of a fraught history, as there's a real desire to sort of eschew the psychedelic or the psychoactive component that allows addicts to come into this frame. And I want to respect that. I don't want to, I'm not here to sort of overturn a 12-step model, but I do think that historically there's some interesting tension and synergies there that allowed for these two to actually work together cooperatively for a time.
Right. And then so at the end of the 50s, I guess you have Timothy Leary tries psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico, I think, and then starts his psilocybin research project in Harvard, which moves on to LSD, and then the very famous episodes of what happened in the 60s. What's your kind of take on the, I guess, the cultural and political factors that got us to the situation we're now in, where you have these medicines being illegal?
Yeah, can I chop that up into two different questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
I almost think that we're in a different situation again now from where we were after the sort of Timothy Learyism, if you will. So if I chop it up a little bit, so yeah, 1961, 62 is a really interesting moment. This is when the Harvard experiments that Leary was in charge of kind of become known publicly, and it really sort of catapults this research into a public conversation that prior to this, I think, relatively speaking, was taking place within scientific circles. So I think there's a sort of psychedelic heyday, but it wasn't necessarily in the New York Times, and it wasn't showing up in mainstream news, and it was still very much sort of within academic circles, even if it wasn't all academics involved. By 1962, that changes, and I think Timothy Leary is in part a main player in that change, partly because his research, sounds and is so scandalous and so risque and salacious that, it makes the front page headlines. But also, he's very charismatic, and he defends this research and he defends this approach, but also sort of like throws caution to the wind and says, throws Harvard under the bus in a way. And so he becomes this kind of embodiment of a character that psychedelic enthusiasts want to believe in. He becomes a champion, he's a leader, he's a guru, he's very provocative and very charismatic. And I think he becomes a bit of a leader of something that had been kind of bubbling beneath the surface. At the same time, it also throws a wrench into the conversations amongst scientists as to how now to react to this publicity that they weren't really dealing with before. So you didn't have the Kennedys calling you and asking, what's happening in mental health research with psychedelics. They were very interested in mental health research, but now psychedelics are on the radar and everyone's worried about the ethics of that. In Canada and in Britain and throughout most of Western Europe, thalidomide was also, I think, an important component of this. The United States never authorized the direct sale of thalidomide, so it's less of a matter in the United States, but as thalidomide comes forward, as it is, hailed initially as one of those sort of pharmaceuticals that's being sold to the public as a safe drug, and as children are born with teratogenic growth defects, it also creates a real sort of public health campaign and an image of science gone wrong, or science that hasn't been tested properly or safely enough to bring out to consumers. And I think that the campaigns around that and the publicity around thalidomide really sort of shake public confidence in the scientific community to make appropriate recommendations for what is safe. And as psychedelics and Learyism and others, but he certainly embodies a certain character of that, those sort of come together at the same time, like literally in the same year. Those kind of headlines are clashing or taking up space on major newspapers. And I think it changes the conversation quite dramatically, both about how do we trust science. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring comes out at the same time as well. She's talking about environmental toxicity. And so there's a cynicism growing here about how much faith to put in our scientists to keep us healthy and safe. And I think psychedelics in some parts get caught up in that. Part of it, I will say personally, I think is due to Leary and his absolutely enormous ego and capacity to get in front of television cameras. Had he been an introvert, he may not have fulfilled the role that he did. But I think this would have happened without Leary, because I think there were a variety of other contextual features that were shaking our sort of public confidence in the public health authorities and in scientific figures. Okay, so fast forward to today. I think that the psychedelic renaissance, as Ben Sessa has called it, and many, many people have picked that up now, I think is aptly named. It is interesting to see this kind of resurrecting of some of these ideas, but I think it's also fascinating to think about, and I'd be curious your thoughts on this. I think just like in the 1950s, as there was a kind of social or cultural cynicism about the state of mental health therapies, the paradigm that we were living in per se, psychoanalytic therapies or bodily therapies, lobotomies and whatnot, people were questioning their utility. And we sort of rolled into this psychopharmaceutical paradigm. And I think in 2020, not just because it's good for hindsight, in the year 2020, we look back and think, well, are opiates really the best way of dealing with pain? Are we creating addictions by subscribing to a model of not just mental health and mental illness treatments, but of dealing with trauma, of dealing with all sorts of kind of human discomfort using a psychopharmaceutical frame? And I think there is a sort of general exhaustion with that model and a questioning of it that allows for thinking about alternatives yet again. And we see this cycle through the history of psychiatry, the history of neuroscience. And I think there's another moment here of questioning and agitation for searching for alternatives that both has us looking backwards. What did we miss in those Indigenous models? What have we missed from the past? But also looking forward, like, what are we doing with palliative care? Which is a conversation that is taking on a veracity that we haven't seen really to this degree in the past. And yeah. I think there's a different moment here unfolding that I'm quite excited to witness.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right as well, that it's high time for those kinds of questions that you were saying, those kinds of reckonings with the way we currently think about mental health care. And I mean, through my education, the thing that I guess stood out to me most strongly was the way that the narratives we get, the kind of cultural narratives around things like addiction, depression, are very neat narratives that fit into the prevailing economic system. And instead of looking at, when especially something like addiction and depression clearly is, it's influenced by a variety of factors in your life, right? In your health, how you're living your life. But a culture that doesn't want to look at those issues, take something like addiction in Indigenous communities in North America, it's easier to say, well, perhaps there's a genetic thing, rather than, well, perhaps there's been incredible trauma inflicted on these people, and perhaps there should be some kind of reparation. That's a far more, the economic system doesn't, I think that's a far less comfortable thing to think about. And so do you think that psychedelics could have the potential in this renaissance to maybe help us envision new models of healthcare?
I try to avoid questions like this because I plead historian. I'm like, I only look backwards. But I mean, it's a flippant response, but I'm rather hopeful. I'm rather optimistic that I don't think that psychedelics are a magic bullet. I don't really believe in magic bullets, to be quite honest. I don't think it's, going to necessarily transform the way we think, but I do think that opening up the possibility and allowing for research and study and thoughtful, interrogation, not just within laboratories perhaps, but thinking about these things also allows us to imagine diversity in different ways, both in terms of diversity of healthcare options, but also diversity of experiences and how to prioritize those kinds of the knowledge, the experience that comes with it, thinking about trauma in different ways, for example, which is a really big area of research, I think. I do think that there's a reckoning that will open beyond, the focus on the molecules themselves, but to thinking about, that larger context. I'm not sure we'll see like a countercultural revolution, much like we might sort of caricature of the 1960s. But I think there are really exciting possibilities, and I'll maybe end with palliative care. I think this is a really interesting area. Canada just had its first legal psilocybin trial with a palliative patient here a couple of weeks ago. It happened in Saskatoon, which I find is really interesting, that we've kind of come full circle with Saskatchewan being, strangely the place of the word psychedelic, and then here it is again in a new iteration of this moment. I think palliative care is interesting in part because the word itself was coined in 1987. We didn't have palliative units, although people have been dying forever. But thinking about dying care, theorizing dying care, and focusing on it as part of something that we might demand even as modern humans, has brought a different kind of political energy into that space. And it's interesting to think that it's also a different group of people who are going through those palliative care units. So it's not niche. This isn't just for, expensive patients who have particular kinds of disorder X. But this is a different kind of space for different conversations and a different kind of humanity and dignity that's afforded to dying care. I think psychedelics in that space is a really interesting place to have this conversation anew, because it allows for different players to participate in that conversation who might be a little bit hesitant to endorse the use of psychedelics in a way that they see associated with replacing addiction or harm reduction or something. I don't agree with those narratives, but I think there is a kind of resistance to endorsing psychedelics like cannabis. But I think if we imagine it in a different space, we can start talking about spirituality. Spirituality is already present in the palliative care unit. There's different ways in which that might challenge us as, today's civilization, if you will, but like even challenge specific professional organizations who work and interact in that space to imagine psychedelics in a different way. And those are not necessarily the same people who would have endorsed it otherwise. I think that's really important to find those kinds of alliances now. If we imagine a world where psychedelics are decriminalized, I think it's not going to come from, with all due respect, a handful of champions, but it's going to require some kind of broad-based endorsement of a different model that challenges our current system.
Right, yeah, and I think it also, you're mentioning kind of broadening from just focusing on the molecule, and you also mentioned kind of different ways of knowing in the past. I think, and also to bring this full circle, bringing it back to the indigenous use of these things and integrating the ways these have always been used, right? Instead of presuming that the kind of white-coated scientists can just do it all by themselves without integrating that. I think that has real potential for changing the way that we think about how we look after each other.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, COVID has presented us with a whole variety of challenges, but there's also, I think we see the ways in which health is political, and our healthcare is intensely political, and it's not just, waiting for a bed in a particular clinic, but we're all affected by this in some way or another. And I think it's a moment that we may be able to seize upon as we sort of imagine the way that people are more alive to the ideas about the ways in which health and access to healthcare are deeply political.
Right. And I'm sure COVID is also providing the medical historians of the future with a huge amount of material in this kind of digital age. I mean, it's got to be a strange silver lining maybe for people in your profession.
It's true. We've joked, my colleagues and I've joked, wow, who knew that historians had some kind of public significance?
Yeah. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate this.